Hey, everybody. Good morning.
Morning.
All right. Well, it looks like we've got a pretty full agenda today. So, Ben, do you want to lead us off?
Yep. I'll try to go quickly through this. So this is just a question about trust domain migration to kind of get an idea of whether anyone uses this. It was added in 1.4. It's still an alpha, which when I realized it was a thing we supported, made me wonder if it's maybe due for an up or out discussion. The trust domain migration is something we document doing, makes sense, but I think the real point of contention is the trust domain alias stuff there, which is basically saying that whatever your trust domain is, we always respect cluster.local as like a secret, always trusted trust domain. And we just tell you, like, look, you can, if you just set everything to cluster.local, you never have to migrate when you change your trust domain, which I don't think is great for a variety of reasons. One, I think we should probably only respect the trust domain that you declare. Two, having a trust domain that you put in your policy that would be respected even if you don't explicitly put it in your authorization policy seems a little suspect to me, right? It's not very declarative to say you didn't put this trust domain in your policy, but we'll let it through anyway because it's secretly allowed. Two, and three, I don't really think it helps with upgrades that much. Trust domain migration is something you would do pretty infrequently, I suspect, and it will work without aliases. It's just a little, you would just basically have to say, look, if I want a clean migration, I would add the old and the new trust domain to my auth policies, and then the upgrade would work just as well as it would with the alias, except in that case, you're actually explicitly saying the trust domains in your policies that you want to support. And we don't have the secret alias anymore. We also don't support aliases in ambient right now. And so the question is more of, if we want to keep doing, we still want to support trust domain migration. If we do we want to keep aliases, and do we want to add aliases to ambient? I don't care about migration. I just don't think the alias stuff is really necessary because it's not declarative. It's a real kind of documentation got you. I don't think many people are aware it even exists and works in this way. And I would prefer we pick something where you're just explicit in your policies about what trust domains you expect and will accept, rather than having some hard-coded default that is let through anyway, even if it's not in your policy, which is a little weird. That's it.
Just a clarification. Sorry to jump in, Costin. I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. In my mind, there's two different things here. There's an implicit expansion of cluster.local and OSCE policies to mean the current trust domain. And then there's a separate feature that is trust domain aliases, which impacts more than OSCE policy and says that all these trust domains are fungible, basically.
Yep.
When you say aliases, are you always referring to add to that last one there, Ben? Or were you also in some cases referring to the other one? Or
I am talking only about aliases here in the context of the migration, where we tell people to use a trust domain that is to use a secretly trusted trust domain so that they can avoid a slight amount of effort churning their auth policies. Which I would rather.
Right, which one though? Which one? There's two different, completely different mechanisms that are both achieving that same goal. So that's why I want to make sure we're not mixing them. Right.
The part that I'm talking about is, and I might not understand this fully here, but the part that I'm talking about is we are now telling people for migration, we are telling people of migration purposes in this specific doc, just use cluster.local so that whenever your trust domain changes, it doesn't impact your auth policies because we don't reference your trust domain in the auth policies, which is sort of a weird situation where that to me is like saying we're asking people to create two trust domains and ignore one of them so that they could just use ours, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Okay, so that's the expansion. Sorry, Costin, I keep cutting you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. Just want to clarify the same thing. First of all, trust aliases are pretty broadly used in JKE, for example, where we use a very specific trust domain for. And migration is not only about migrating your authorization policies. In fact, you should never use trust domain in authorization policy. You should use the service account, because there are two fields in authorization. I never understood why someone would hard code the trust domain and put the fully qualified SPIF URL instead of using the service account, which is kind of the primary identity. And we have some statistics, actually half people happen to use one, half use the other. I'm probably looking forward to someone who is using the other to explain why they want the extra pain, but that's a different story. But what I wanted to say is that secure naming we keep forgetting that the most important thing in Istio and most commonly used is actually secure naming, which is how do you verify the server identity? And that's where trust domain is super critical. And it's not only for migration, it's also for permanent use. I mean, there are people who just happen to use, different trust domain as some going thing because it's a useful feature. It's well documented, not secret. So yeah, that's all I had to say.
Yeah, I almost agree with you, Costin, except that there's no service account field in authorization policy, unless I just can't find it.
Oh, sorry, namespace.
Okay,
We
yeah.
didn't because in reality, all service accounts are fungible. So it's half of the people use a namespace field, basically restrict access to the other namespace or to the local namespace. Service account, pretty much any pod can take any service account. Is not a very strong barrier. We discussed it when this was introduced, and it was to find, and also with versioning, you tend to use different service account for each pod, so it becomes very difficult to keep track, like we for STOD.
Yeah, I get that. Like, I think some people have different opinions on that, and that's probably why they go to principal. The only reason you would do the problem is that we have namespace or the full principal. We don't have namespace plus service account, but without the full principal. If we had that, then there would be no need for the cluster.local expansion, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, and there may be other places where the expansion is used, but I'm only talking about it in terms of migration. Like I don't know how often people would migrate trust domains, and I don't want to just support the alias so that to make the migration slightly easier. It feels like that's basically letting principals through that are not declared in the policy just to make something that is a very rare occurrence easier, which seems like optimizing for the wrong thing. And so that's why I wanted to bring this up before we go and see if we want to add it to ambient to kind of understand what do people use this feature a lot, this migration, and do they use aliases in the context of this migration feature quite a bit or not?
So to jump in a bit, but I want to clarify, it's not only for migration. These trust alias allow migration. That's clear. It's useful. It's nice, but it's not. Nobody says that you cannot use it for other purposes because it's very useful long term. If you happen to have a mesh where you have different cluster with different trust domains, like you have one GKE cluster, but the trust domain must be in a particular format, and you have another trust domain, and you put both of them and you use them permanently, not only for migration, but as a way to define aliases, because the feature is not migration, in mesh config, it's aliases. And aliases means, it's alias.
It's letting it through. Yeah, well, I think John is right? Like, it's because we only let you do the whole principle, or we don't really have a nice way for you to do anything other than put the whole Spiffy ID as the principal. And in that way, we are basically we're basically saying there are principles that are not listed we will allow through, which doesn't feel good to me. But I think if we can maybe talk about doing something where we support service account and namespace instead and let people match on those, then we can not recommend this specific approach in the docs, and it'll be a little easier, which I think is probably good enough. But yeah, I'll let Adil talk.
So I think even when you take into outside of the ALV policy issue, there's still a secure naming piece that you're going to run into, and as far as use cases where people will want to do the migration, I work with folks who have a security policy that all of their certificates have to have all certificates have to end in their company's. Have to have a sign with their company's full URL at the end as the trust domain. So they have to do a migration. The next security policy is being rolled out. So that's exactly the use case that I think about for this trust domain migration. I think that I won't say that it's common, but it feels not insignificant and not uncommon for larger corporations to have those sort of requirements.
Yeah, so one thing that's kind of been bothering me about the doc is that this cluster.local expansion can't be used for a trust domain migration. If you go follow the doc, you will have an outage, like a cluster-wide outage. You need trust domain aliases to do that. So the only thing it's really useful for, and if you use trust domain aliases, then you don't actually need this, because basically it's saying that cluster.local is not special. Any of the aliases are fungible with each other. Right. So the only thing that it's actually useful for is to say, I want to write a policy and I don't care. about the trust domain, and we happen to not have a service account field, so I had to stick something there.
Yeah.
So it's actually not a migration. Like our doc is terrible. I'm not saying the doc doesn't say that, but in my mind, it has actually nothing to do with migration. The alias case, yes, that does. So that's just a weird quirk because you can't put a star. No, you can't put a star key. Actually, you might be able to.
But you don't want.
I think it does. I think we
You
support it.
certainly don't want to do that. I mean, a star is far, far worse than a list of aliases from a security point of view. It will break security definitely hard in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, technically that's matching any certificate, right? So it's not necessarily even a spiffy certificate.
Right. I was assuming the spiffy prefix. I was just, but yes, the full thing would be spiffy : //
Yeah, but
star
you can't
trust
do.
domain section.
I don't think you can do a glob in the middle. It's only a prefix or suffix. Oh, actually, looks like we don't have to. It might work. Actually, it might work.
Even if you put a globe, you don't want globe. I mean, it's worse. I mean, that will mean allow arbitrary, completely arbitrary certificates that you don't want. I mean, list is completely different than a globe.
Well, I think we put spiffy. Let me see how the code actually works.
Star.mycompany.com, star.local, what? You
No, I think we implicitly add the spiffy before or something. So I don't know. I'll have to double check how those rules work. It's obviously way more under documented and more complicated than it should be.
Now, one comment. I don't think the feature itself on authorization, where if you have an explicitly fully qualified spiffy principal, I don't think we should use aliases. I mean, in an authorization policy for secure naming, yes. For if you use namespace field, yes. But if you explicitly specify, a particular spiffy trust domain, that should be the only one that is. I mean, I kind of agree that it should never be used in an authorization policy if it's explicit.
If you are explicit with it, we do not implicitly allow some other secret trust domain to pass it, is what you're saying, right? If you're explicit, we only that I tend to agree with that. I think that part is only the only place where we would tell people to do that is in this migration doc. So I think we can just say don't do that in the migration doc and we might be okay. I don't know if we have code for that too, but at least the doc should probably not recommend that, and then we make sure that the code recommends that in the migration scenario if we can.
It almost seems like for policy, you don't want to specify a single trust domain. You want to say whatever this cluster's trust domain is, and if that trust domain is in the process of changing, that might be one of two trust domains, old and new.
Yeah.
If you've got the trust domain hard-coded effectively in each of these policies, then trust domain migration involves modifying each of these policies, right?
Yep. Adding the old and the new to each policy, which you can do today. But that is troublesome, but it is at least explicit. There's cases where people might want the trust domain in the policies, and there's cases like John is saying and Costa is saying where people might not care about the trust domain. You could have both policies in the same cluster even, so it's a little tricky. But I agree that we should probably respect what's declared as like the source of truth.
So it sounds like this merits like a full-on design doc for what the user flow is, how it works today, what needs to be changed. Does that sound about right to everyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. My general thought is that we probably want aliasing in ambient. We probably need to figure out how the cluster.local expansion works because it's not clear. Or even if it does exist, I honestly am not even sure if it exists anymore or if it's just being replaced by trust domain aliases. So we should figure that out.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I'm really worried about all of our docs are using cluster local, and if people install Istio with a particular trust domain and then try to set up book info and apply policy or see policy that refers to cluster local in the principal, and boom, nothing works. So the fact that we don't support point cluster local to the actual trust domain, would cause a lot of pain for people following our docs.
Yeah, I also don't want to just say use cluster local everywhere, in which case there's not much point in supporting a customizable trust domain because we're telling people create one, don't use it, and use ours, which is also not great. So,
Well, we're not saying in the certificates, we're just saying in the policies, right?
right, but still, like policies are what people are interacting with.
All right. Yeah, sounds like we just need to do some more research on this and can continue discussion on a doc or next week or something. Does that sound right?
Yep.
So
Do you have
as part of
anyone-
the
Sorry, I was going to ask, do we have anyone willing to drive this forward?
I can do it since I brought it up, unless someone else is really excited to go for it.
I think we'd at least be interested in helping collaborate on a proposal here, because we definitely like have use cases for trust domains.
Okay, dope. I'll reach out to you.
Cool, thanks.
That's right.
Does this mean that we are wanting to that we agree to move this to beta / stable? Sorry, GA, or have we not made that decision quite yet?
Probably should do the doc first and kind of understand what the situation is before we make that. I would prefer to do the design doc of like how it should work before we decide what to do with the kernel.
But
Yeah, but
Agreed.
I think one thing though is this is not stopping us shipping anything, right, from sidecar or ambient. I mean, the only
That's
thing
true,
about
yeah.
ambient may be the pointer because we support it in the sidecar, but we're not going to hold any of our sidecar releases train for this because it's been there for multiple releases already.
That's true. It becomes a bigger concern probably if you're migrating or have a mixed cluster, which we aren't really focusing on right now, which makes sense. But I wanted to at least get it out here so that we can have something in the wings for when that becomes a bigger concern.
Ben, I'd be happy to help you with the trust domain work or creating that doc.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, sure thing.
So I want to just ask Summit because I think you are kind of a user of Istio, right? So you said you're using alias. Do you use multiple alias or you just have one alias? What's your feedback on or migration doc on a trust domain alias?
So we use it. So we are also migrating to Istio, and we have an existing mesh. So we use it to connect our existing mesh to the Istio trust domain. If that makes sense.
Yeah, Lynn, like the trust domain alias thing is not a niche feature. There's like 1,000 users that like I can easily go get a list of 1,000 users that use this feature. It's one of the most broadly used features. So that part's not under question, I think.
Okay.
Including some of our customers.
By the way, were you using some other meshes before? Which mesh, Summit?
Yeah. We have our own implementation, internal implementation.
Got it. Thanks.
All right. Are we going on to the next one?
Yep.
I can talk about it. So this kind of cropped up when I was making a PR where I was setting some standard labels for all Istio resources. So my understanding is that in Istio, every workload is part of what's called the canonical service. And when Istio generates traffic telemetry, it'll take note of the source and destination canonical service, specifically the name and the revision of that canonical service, which are set via labels on the workload. These fields are usually set by the user. But there are two cases where we do set them. Those are ingress and egress gateways. And the problem right now is that the canonical revision for the ingress and egress gateways always defaults to latest, like latest. which isn't very useful. And I guess my proposal is to change that to be more informative. So maybe like the Istio version. And the problem is that this is a breaking change, maybe because it would change the telemetry for user workloads that interact with ingress and egress gateways. And I guess the two kind of arguments I have where maybe it's not really a breaking change is that if a user is upgrading their cluster, which is when they would see this change, a change in provision is like somewhat plausible. And at the same time, I couldn't find any place where we specify what these values are or should be set to. So maybe it's not a breaking change because we don't specify it, but maybe people do rely on it, which, what's part of our API. So yeah, do we want to change it and have a potentially breaking change, but a more descriptive telemetry?
Stephen, when you say see also warnings about Docker tag latest, can you, is there a link we should follow there to understand the context?
Ben wrote that.
Yeah, I wrote that. It's basically the problem of they tell you everywhere not to use latest for your Docker tag because it's a moving pointer, right? So it doesn't tell you anything about what you're referring to. It's sort of the same problem here. If you emit a bunch of metrics that have Istio version latest, and you go back and 6 months later, you look at your metrics database and you have no idea what actual Istio version those came from because latest could mean anything. It's latest at the time you installed it. So that's maybe not a good value to keep in metrics, but we probably need to put something here.
That seems reasonable. And as far as it being a breaking change, this only happens when you don't have revisions defined.
Yeah.
So that means that the value will be latest across all of the cluster. So it's very unlikely that anyone would be selecting based on that value. Does that make sense?
That's my intuition. Yeah, so it's what do we do here basically? What value should this have if there is no revision? Should it be default instead of latest, or should it be the actual version, or do we maybe not populate it at all as a label if there is no revision? That's that's another question, but probably not worth. We worked around it, I think, in the issue where it came up, so it's not pressing, but it's something to think about.
I could see why you would want this to be the value of the revision if revision labels are present, particularly if you've changed something about your revision that was not the minor version of Istio
Right.
or patch. You might want to see an A/B comparison in your metrics. However, if you have no revisions, we've got to default back to something, and latest definitely does not make sense for that.
Okay, yeah. I'd be inclined to go with default, since default is what we already say for no revision, I think, pretty much everywhere. I originally was thinking that this could be, we could use like the actual app version here as a fallback, but thinking about it now more, and I don't actually think that anymore, because I don't believe we should have a label that has mixed semantics. If it's for revisions, it shouldn't have versions, and if it's for versions, it shouldn't have revisions, because they're not the same. So I don't want to mix them.
Yeah, one thing to clarify, when in the label name canonical revision, that revision word there has absolutely nothing to do with revisions as an Istio concept. It's basically the name of that is, I think it's a terrible name. But
Okay.
it's not described to a concept. This is typically to describe applications, like users' applications. Canonical name probably should have been called application name and application version. And what is an application's version? That's entirely up to the application owner. They could decide to call it commit. They could decide to call it version 1, 2, 3, 1.2, 1.3, foo, bar, focal, Xenial, Bionic, whatever the hell they want. Like, it's their own application, so they can.
Right. Yeah. I think the difficulty though is that in our charts, we're not, we under different situations, we'll set it to either the actual app version or a revision, which makes the semantics of the label sort of confusing. Like, what
I think we only ever set it to the revision, which probably was because someone who originally added that label to the Helm chart didn't realize that the name was confusing. Like, I don't know. It was many years ago, so I don't remember.
Okay.
Just a guess, though.
Yeah.
And then we've been stuck with it. But that is what the label means. And it's not an Istio first party component label. Like, this is to describe the user's applications. We just happen to run one application that does report metrics. So
my suggestion is, if we fix it, it should be opt-in, not necessarily, we cannot, because it's backward compatibility risk is too big. But at the same time, I suggest looking, if we are fixing it and we change the label, I would suggest looking at the semantic conventions, which are now relatively even more and more adopted every day. We discuss every time we discuss it, and actually have user opt-in to use whatever the semantic conventions define in OpenTelemetry. So basically, user will opt in to use the labeling, the proper labeling, and leaves the whole label in place for existing users.
What semantic? Do you mean like changing it to the actual version, or using?
No, I mean, user should opt in to use for OpenTelemetry semantic conventions for this particular purpose. Use the labels that is defined in OpenTelemetry semantic conventions with the value that is defined there, and not generate this label. So basically, the user will switch. The default behavior remains the same, but user can switch the behavior to have a new label, which is the one defined by OpenTelemetry, with the value that is defined, because they define what this should be, I believe, in their conventions.
Okay.
yeah, this may be a bit of a defeatist attitude, but in my mind, we have a label. It has some meaning. We've given it some value. The value is not stupid. It's maybe not the best option, but it at least has some logic to it. No one has complained about it for the 5 years it's been set. We happen to stumble upon it while making a totally unrelated change. There's a risk in compatibility to change it. I would just not change it. Like, there's a high effort to do it, high risk of making someone unhappy by changing it, and likely little value given that no one's actually asked for it. If we're going to make breaking changes and things, I would really like to keep them to things where there's actually demand from real users to show that there's actually benefit. Otherwise, we're just going to be in big debates about things that actually don't matter, and it's a big way to waste time and burn out all of our maintainers.
I get that, but if I don't want to have discussions over semantics that there are no tests around. So if there are semantics that even if they're bad, we want to protect, we need to have tests around them, or contributors can't really change things without breaking an untested and sort of undocumented set of semantics.
There was a test. That's how we noticed it. The test failed, right? If you want to go add a test that for like every single possible label on every single metric for every single component in Istio, be my guest. Like, I would love to see that.
There was a test, but it wasn't clear what the test was trying to fence and why, or what this label even did.
Well, so come on, you can't say I didn't understand the test, so we should break the behavior. That's not a
no. But I'm saying that what the test is, the behavior the test is trying to describe is not really well defined. There's not.
Sure.
This label doesn't have good semantics, and maybe we keep it with bad semantics, but we still have to make it so that people touching other things don't accidentally break a semantic they don't understand because it's not very well defined. Like, that's
sure. No one's going to argue that Istio has good documentation or good tests, or even a higher bar, good documentation for why we're testing the things we're testing. That's absolutely clear, and I think everyone would be happy to improve those. But that doesn't
good APIs.
or good APIs. But that doesn't mean we should go change them, right? And that's kind of similar to my comment on Keith on the side chat of like the canonical revision name is confusing. I agree. I don't think that means we should do anything about it.
I don't want to necessarily do anything about it, but I don't want its lack of definition to make it harder for people to make unrelated contributions, which was kind of where we got to with this one, which is a little bit of a smell for me. But I agree. Outside of that, I don't really give a crap about changing it, because whatever, it's a label.
Going back on what John said about customer asking for it or having a use case for making the change or something like that. The reason I suggested adopting the OpenTelemetry semantic convention is that native applications and a lot of other things generate that particular label, and there is a use case and real value for users to have a consistent way to indicate the versions across multiple systems, not only for Istio, but also for people who use open SDKs in different languages and generate telemetry natively. So that will be the main use case and the value for the user to, and they have tests, they have, because they have multiple implementation in different languages, and they have a clear definition, which we don't. So we solve pretty much all the problems at the same time.
So it's a decision kind of to leave it as it is and add tests to keep to kind of fence the behavior. Oh, yep. Okay.
All right, I think we have consensus. Backwards compatibility is our top priority for the project. So Stephen, thank you so much for raising this. Would appreciate if you can maybe add some comment and tests, just make other people who is contributing to similar code would be more clear to Ben's concern about contribution.
Okay.
All right, thank you. With that, let's move to Keith's topic. We still have 2 more topics. So.
Yeah, now for something a lot less controversial. There was a discussion that popped up in Slack around promoting Envoy filter to V1 to indicate that it is that we're not going to remove it and that the resource itself is stable. That obviously led into a lot of discussion back and forth. And I threw this out there as a kind of as a joke, but I am slowly convincing myself that it's worth looking deeper into. And that is moving Envoy filter to a new group, something along the lines of unsafe.istio.io. And there's just the sidebar in the chat. Where I was doing some discussion with John. The core problem with Envoy filter is that we're trying to tell users that this is not a safe resource, and so we're keeping it perma alpha. But at the same time, we also are not going to change the resource that Envoy filter ever. Like I think if anybody tries to push a PR to change Envoy filter, it's just going to get denied. Likewise, there's an issue open to add Envoy filter support to ambient. And that was like, yeah, no, this is not being, or to waypoints, it's like, this is not really supported for sure now and may not ever be supported. And then as a case in point, I got notification during this call actually with somebody saying, oh, the Envoy filter execution order broke between a couple of Istio versions. In my mind, this is exactly the sort of thing that we are trying to tell users about could break with Envoy filter that we don't plan to support. So I'm not married to this idea by any stretch of the imagination. I do think it's worth considering if we can be more explicit about one, the stability of the API. So we're not going to, I'll clarify, we're not going to make a breaking change to the Envoy filter API that exists in Istio. And by API, I mean the Envoy filter CRD, the custom resource. I should be even more specific. We're not going to make breaking changes to that. At the same time, we also want to indicate to users that you are in for non-obvious breaking changes, and that could affect you. So, just want to throw that out there.
So is the proposal to use this new group to indicate it's unsafe? And then the fact the API version has alpha today is not sufficient?
That's the idea. I think Craig started the thread in Slack, basically trying to figure out what is the posture of the resource and trying to find it. Yeah, here it is. It's a little long. But he's saying there's no concepts or overview for Envoy filter. With the idea, that's what it was. The idea being, if we're trying to adopt sort of an up or out sort of approach with our resources, could Envoy filter be moved out? And like for me, it's like, no, we shouldn't remove Envoy filter. Like it's an escape hatch. There's always going to be need to write some custom config, and we have very non-trivial features that are only possible with Envoy filter. But it's so yeah, it's like if we're forced between those two extremes, either removing Envoy filter or moving it to alpha, I'd much prefer to just move it to its own group that has the unsafe that indicates a lack of safety, and then make that more stable.
I don't have much to say other than I don't want to do this. It's all pain and no benefit in my mind. It actually might be even more pain for you. And I don't want to conjecture too much here, but I mean, I thought your plan for your product was to support all the V1 APIs. So if you made it V1, wouldn't that make it worse for you? Like in my mind, the naming of resources is irrelevant. And we went through a lot of pain to rename things to V1. And that's a much, much easier rename because Kubernetes has native support for it. Renaming the group is like 10 times more pain for a resource we don't care about. And it's changing a name that doesn't really matter. Like alpha versus unsafe, it's, you know, they both have similar meanings. Like we clearly document everywhere we have Envoy filters. Don't use this. If you apply them to the cluster, you get a warning from kubectl. It says, hey, you're doing something stupid. Take caution. Like we've done, I'm happy to add any more warnings anywhere we can, but let's not put a bunch of pain on ourselves and users and add like this is weeks of work for users and us to do with no benefit really. Minimal benefit, I should say.
There are many things that are less safe than Envoy filter and that we have in mesh config and other places. I mean, it's that can break the user even worse than mesh config that we don't currently step. So are we moving mesh config to unsafe, or are we moving, there are a lot of V1 APIs that are relatively unsafe and will change when we adopt ambient because the behavior changes. Nothing is really, I mean, we kind of already messed up the semantics of alpha. Let's not make unsafe mean something else. Because again, some people will have to use it, some other things are, yeah, I don't like this.
And I guess my question is, it sounds like we're satisfied with the status quo. And if that's generally the consensus, then I'm happy to like disagree and commit here. In other conversations I've had just in general with people in the community, like it feels like nobody really likes Envoy filter existing. And I guess my question is, I think I know the answer based on the responses to this suggestion. Even though we might not like Envoy filter as it exists today, we don't dislike it enough to change the status quo. Is that sort of the? Am I right in how I'm interpreting that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Honestly, a lot of people I know, when they use Envoy filter, they know it's alpha, but they didn't have a choice. I mean, it's so much harder to use than any of the Istio resources, but they didn't have a choice, so they still, went ahead and did it.
All right, that's good enough for me. We can. I'm happy to copy in the spirit of our discussion in the TOC meeting on Monday. I'm happy to or let's Ben beat me to it, on the decision and sort of the rationale for it, so this doesn't come back up again. And I can point to this next time. Next time we somebody we complain about Envoy filter, it might even be myself. I can look at this and know that consensus wise, we don't really want to do too much else.
All right. Thank you so much, Keith, for bringing this up. Jeremy, you're up next.
Yeah, this is just something that I saw on the community Slack. I think Shulene is on the call, but she had a question. I just want to get other people involved that might have more context to help answer it. And Shulene, if you want to jump in and add any more context, I see that you added another line.
Yeah, sure. I guess a little background is I'm currently working at an organization that is looking into moving our homegrown service mesh to Istio. Of course, that means backporting a lot of the features that we've depended on. And one of those things is a more complex version of locality load balancing. But I do think this might be useful to other organizations as well. So from the docs, what I see right now is that you can either choose between failover priority, or distribution. And I think something we're interested in is if we can combine failover priority and distribution. This specific scenario here I have is that, say you have 3 regions, and it doesn't have to be regions per se, it could be 3 zones, 3 subzones, or 3 like arbitrary labels that you created for your locality load balancing. But say we have 3 regions, A, B, and C. In a normal circumstance, they would fail over to each other. But then if you want to maybe dial your traffic between A and B, but you still want C to be available for failover, there's currently no way to illustrate that in Istio. So I was thinking maybe something with a combination of the concepts of failover priority and distribution could fill that role. And before I make any code changes or doc, I just wanted to see if that idea has been popular or unpopular with the maintainers at this point.
It's kind of like a meta question. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask it. These are features, as I understand it, that are supported in Envoy today, but that Istio doesn't expose. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, in Envoy, you can basically format your locality load balancing groups any way you like. But within Istio, you're kind of constrained to use the failover priority, failover distribute settings.
Okay, thanks. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess so. This is kind of like a meta question, but I wanted to see if anyone was more familiar with the current state of what like topology-aware load balancing failover is like in Kubernetes itself. Because I know that's gone through like several revisions and at least like one currently in progress proposal.
Yeah, the current state is there is a field called traffic distribution where you can say prefer close, true or false. So it's effectively
so very coarse-grained.
Yeah, and it's effectively like a failover. Like it doesn't say exactly how an implementation should prefer, whether it's you gradually fail over or if there's 0 endpoints and you send them. But there's definitely no way to say like I want 90% traffic to A, 10% to B, and fail over to C. That's for sure not part of the API.
Okay. I do definitely see the value in being able to specify that more granularly.
Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't looked into this in a little bit, but am I correct in understanding that Istio doesn't actually leverage the zone-aware routing feature of Envoy?
That is correct. We use priorities for the locality groups in endpoints.
Okay, that's what I thought. So I think that's maybe the inherent limitation here, is that when you use like Istio is presenting an API for weighted routing and failover with outlier detection. but I think it's all backed by the same priority implementation. So there's some mutually exclusive. I feel like I've brought this up before, so apologies if I've just forgotten. But what's blocking us from utilizing zone-aware routing? Did it just not exist at the time that we chose priorities in Istio?
No, it's really specialized to a very specific use case. I don't know whoever contributed it. Like you have to have a very one-to-one mapping of workloads and services and have a kind of static knowledge of what service you are at startup and like never changes. Like it's a very specialized thing. Like it assumes that every like a cluster corresponds, like you have one cluster for yourself and everyone has the same notion that like, hey, there's the Keith cluster and Keith knows I'm the Keith cluster. And then you can do it all. But we have like many clusters for one pod, right? And like one for each service, one for each port. They can change all those different things. So
interesting.
If it helps with the discussion, I'm not that interested in zone-aware routing. I'm more interested in adding different priority levels when you're using the distribute configuration, or vice versa, like to put something like distribute underneath failover priority, and not particularly asking for anybody here to do that for me. I just want to float this idea and see if there's opposition or if there's support. If so, I can likely contribute something like this.
Yeah, I'm just curious what the use case is. Like with the distribute feature, we've had it since the beginning. And I don't know that I've ever talked to someone that actually used it. Or when, actually used it when they should be using it, at least. Like, why do you want to send 10% of the traffic to B, I guess is the question I would have.
Yeah, within my company, we do have an established pattern where you can send arbitrary amount of traffic to different regions compared to other regions, but at the same time, set up failover regions if none of those regions are available. It's a bit overkill, but it's a feature that people have been relying on for a long time. The use case I see here usually is people are migrating from one region to another. Another case would be when they actually want to shut down one entire region entirely. So they're slowly migrating traffic off of one region, but temporarily for like a DR exercise.
The other use case that I've seen for this is basically being able to like pre-warm an in-memory cache so that you have a service that's ready to receive traffic rather than it is at risk of like having everything fail over at once, having like a cold start that it can't handle.
I mean, if you have a use case, I think it's useful, and probably other people have the same use case. So it's not but I don't think we can say we should not implement it. It's probably valuable to implement it. My concern is how it's going to be reflected in API, because the API is already complicated and very few people fully understand it. If you can express it through, some unsafe API or some other APIs that is not introducing, for a relatively narrow set of users which are super advanced, to make it more complicated for all users that already have a complicated API. So basically, if you can express it through a different resource, through mesh config, through something that is not basically in the face of everyone, then it will be probably much easier to sell, because it's basically just, it starts as an experimental feature that few people use, and it may evolve, it may change. But I would suggest not trying to change the API first. Start with a kind of attach policy if you use gateway semantics, or some private API if you want, and implement it, test it, let it mature. Let's see how people use it, but don't modify the V1 APIs. That's my only request if you play with this feature.
One question I had: have you done some prototyping of this to like not the API stuff, but that it can be done in Envoy? I'm not. So I have to go refresh my memory, but off the top of my head, I wasn't sure that. Actually, now that I think about it, I think you can do it, but you can still answer the question to probably say the same thing.
Yes, we've been doing it for years.
Okay, with Envoy.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I was mistaken in my memory of how it works. So yeah, that makes sense now. Okay. Cool.
Maybe my ask then, if I'm new to Istio, so maybe you can give me some pointers of where I might be able to ask some more questions around how to add this to mesh config, or like how to get started. Like, would you prefer a design doc first, or like a draft PR, something like that, like the process for introducing such a change?
I think a design doc would be appropriate because at the end of the day, you are going to propose some changes to the API, right? Because this is configurable, right? It can't be static to the rules you wanted here, right? It's going to be needs to be configurable. So you have to, ideally, you want to present options on different places it can be configurable, and we can agree on what's the right place.
Do you actually need real API changes or just reduced validation so that you can have failover and distribute set at the same time?
I'm not sure if it makes sense to have those at the same time.
Okay.
But maybe I can pitch, like, here's an API of what it would look like in destination rule, and then I could get some feedback on how to actually put this in mesh config or somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Just have a small doc of like, here's the API options, and we can talk about it. It doesn't need to be like, you don't need to spend, days on it or make it super robust, but just having something more concrete would be a good next step. Lay out the options and pros and cons and whatnot.
Yeah, and I would also encourage you maybe do a little bit of research on the GitHub issues and people asking these type of things in the past, just to see, is it just you have this request or there are multiple people having that request? Because that data point would be very useful for us as a community to understand, does it make sense to have this in a proper API or not?
Sounds good. I wonder if I should ask my next question, but hopefully it's fast yes or no. Because we are so concerned about this failover feature, another thing that differs between Istio and our current mesh is the over-provisioning factor. It doesn't seem like that is customizable right now. It's at the 140 default value. Would the community be opposed or supportive of a contribution to customize that value somehow as kind of like an experimental flag or environment variable to the control plane?
Do you generally set that on like a per service basis or globally?
We set a global value.
Got it. Yeah, the global ones tend to be a bit easier because it's easier to have an experimental global setting as like an environment variable or mesh config. So
we do have service annotations, and we have ways to express what using a label on a service label. It's not necessarily. I'm not sure global is there is no global. It's per revision really, but yeah, I think and labels may be also used by other control planes.
Shulin, it sounds like you have a really interesting use case, and we do have a track of inviting customers to sort of share, or users to share what their use case is and what they're doing with Istio, what's going well, what's going poorly. If that's something you would be interested or willing to do, that could be very valuable for us, and it could help us to understand the context for some of your requests better as well.
Sure. What forum would that be in, and how would I get started there?
We usually do that in our TOC meetings, although sometimes we've scheduled one-offs in particular for it. Are you on our Istio Slack?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I'll reach out to you there and we'll get something figured out.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for the topic. This wrap up the call. Thanks everybody for joining. Bye.